It was just another Sunday morning in the quiet suburban house Rachel had come to call home, though home was a word that felt distant now. The sun streamed through the curtains, golden and warm, lighting up the familiar cracks in the old wooden floors. Rachel sat at the breakfast bar, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly as the faint hum of the dishwasher filled the silence. Living with her stepfather, Mark, wasn't ideal, but it was what made sense after her mother passed. At 32, Rachel had a life of her own job, her own ambitions. But when the tragedy hit, she found herself moving back into the house she thought she'd left behind forever. Mark had been kind enough to offer the arrangement, insisting they could lean on each other during the difficult transition. It wasn't an offer she could refuse, even though something about it had made her uneasy. Not because Mark was unkind or overbearing, but because of the strange dynamic that had always existed between them. He wasn't her father. He never pretended to be. He'd married her mother when Rachel was already an adult. Their relationship was polite, distant, yet in recent months that distance seemed to blur in ways Rachel couldn't quite explain. She snapped out of her thoughts when Mark entered the kitchen. He was still in his sleep clothes, gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt. His dark hair was tousled, a shadow of stubble lining his jaw. Despite his casual appearance, he carried the same commanding presence that had always defined him. It was a quiet confidence, one that made the room feel smaller when he stepped in. "Morning," he said, his voice deep and a little raspy. He poured himself a glass of water before leaning casually against the counter, his eyes briefly scanning her. "Morning," Rachel replied, sipping her coffee. She felt his gaze linger a second too long, but when she looked up, he was already turning away, grabbing the toaster. "You were up late last night," he remarked, his back to her. Rachel hesitated. She had been up late, curled on the couch with her laptop, pretending to work but mostly scrolling through social media. "Just couldn't sleep," she said lightly, though the truth was she'd been feeling restless lately. Mark glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "You should try getting more rest. It's not good for you to burn out like this." It was the kind of thing a parent might say, but coming from Mark, it felt different, more personal, more intimate. Rachel brushed it off with a small laugh. "I'm fine, don't worry about me." Mark didn't respond, but the silence that followed felt heavy, as if he wanted to say something more, but chose not to. He finished making his toast and sat down across from her at the breakfast bar. The table was small, their knees almost brushing under it. Rachel suddenly felt hyper-aware of the closeness, of how the sunlight caught the lines of his face. "So what's the plan for today?" he asked, biting into his toast. "Nothing much," she replied. "Just a little cleaning, maybe catch up on some reading." He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "You've been working too hard lately. You should take a break." The way he said it made her stomach tighten, a mix of warmth and something else she couldn't quite place. Rachel looked away, focusing on the steam rising from her mug. "I'm fine," she repeated, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. The day passed quietly. Rachel busied herself with chores, folding laundry and vacuuming the living room. She tried to ignore the lingering tension she felt whenever Mark was near. It wasn't new. It had been building for weeks, maybe months. At first she thought she was imagining it, the way his eyes would follow her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his compliments felt too loaded to be casual, but now she wasn't so sure. Later that afternoon, as she dusted the bookshelves in the living room, Mark entered with a glass of water, He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You're always cleaning. You don't have to do everything, you know." Rachel turned, holding the dust rag in her hand. "It keeps me busy," she said, shrugging. He stepped closer, setting the glass down on the coffee table. "You've done enough. Why don't you sit down, relax for a bit?" Rachel hesitated, feeling her pulse quicken. There was nothing overtly strange about his words, but something about the way he said them made her heart race. She forced a smile, brushing past him to place the rag back in the cleaning caddy. "I'm almost done," she said lightly. As she moved past him, she caught the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy and clean, familiar but suddenly overwhelming in its proximity. Mark's hand brushed hers briefly as he reached for the glass on the table, and Rachel felt a jolt of something. Surprise, tension, electricity. She wasn't sure what to call it. "Rachel," he said, his tone softer now. She turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she thought he might say something important, something that would finally break the strange tension between them. But instead, he just smiled faintly and said, "You've got dust on your face." "Oh," she stammered, raising a hand to her cheek. Before she could brush it away, Mark stepped closer and gently wiped it off with his thumb. The touch was brief, but it left her frozen in place, her skin tingling where his hand had been. "There," he said, his voice almost a whisper. He was close now, too close. Rachel could see the flecks of gray in his dark eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he looked at her. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the spell. Mark stepped back abruptly, clearing his throat. "I'll let you finish up," he said, his tone back to normal. He picked up his glass and walked out of the room, leaving Rachel standing there, her mind racing. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events over and over in her head. She told herself it was nothing, that she was overthinking things, but deep down, she knew better. Something had shifted between them, and there was no going back. The house was quiet, save for the faint creaks of the old wood settling. Rachel got up to get a glass of water, hoping the cool drink would calm her nerves. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw the faint glow of light from under Mark's door. She paused, unsure why she felt drawn to it, before shaking her head and heading to the kitchen. As she stood at the sink, sipping her water, she heard a noise behind her. Turning, she saw Mark standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. Rachel nodded, setting the glass down. "Just couldn't sleep." Mark leaned against the door frame, watching her. The way he looked at her sent a shiver down her spine, though she wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. "Me neither," he said, his tone carrying an edge of something unspoken. Rachel swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. The air between them felt heavy, charged. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something she wasn't ready to face. The next morning felt like stepping into a storm about to break. Rachel woke early, the events of the previous night still heavy on her mind. She shook her head, trying to push away the memories of Mark's lingering stares, his touch on her cheek, the quiet weight of his presence. She threw herself into her work, logging into her laptop and answering emails as the coffee brewed in the kitchen. Mark was already there when she walked in to pour herself a cup. He was dressed for the day in jeans and a fitted shirt, casually leaning against the counter as he scrolled through his phone. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening. "You're a burly," he remarked, his tone conversational. Rachel shrugged. "Couldn't sleep much." Mark nodded, his gaze lingering on her longer than necessary before he turned back to his phone. She tried to ignore the way her skin prickled under his attention as she poured her coffee and headed back to her room. Hours passed, but her work couldn't distract her from the uneasy tension brewing between them. Around midday, Rachel decided to go out. She needed space, a chance to clear her head and think about anything other than Mark's penetrating gaze. She grabbed her bag and keys and headed for the door. Going somewhere? Mark's voice stopped her in her tracks. She turned to see him standing in the hallway, his arms crossed casually over his chest. He leaned against the wall, his posture relaxed, but his eyes told a different story, sharp, curious, and faintly amused. "Just out for a bit," she said, trying to sound nonchalant. "I need some air." "Do you want company?" he asked, his tone light but laced with something she couldn't quite place. Rachel hesitated. "No, it's fine. I'll just be a while." Mark studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right. Be safe." She forced a smile and walked out, her heart pounding as she climbed into her car. The way he looked at her, it wasn't how a father figure was supposed to look at someone, and it wasn't the first time she'd felt it. But acknowledging it made her stomach churn with both unease and something else. She spent the afternoon at the park, sitting by the water with a book she barely read. Her thoughts refused to settle, circling back to Mark no matter how hard she tried to focus on the pages. The memory of his touch, his voice, his presence haunted her, filling her with a confusing mix of guilt and longing. By the time she returned home, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the house in warm golden light. Mark was in the kitchen, cooking dinner. The smell of roasted vegetables and seared meat filled the air. "Welcome back," he said, without looking up, his tone easy. "I figured I'd make something for us." Rachel set her bag down by the door, hesitating in the hallway. She wanted to decline, to retreat to the safety of her room, but something about the warmth in his voice, or maybe the memory of the tension between them, kept her rooted in place. "Thanks," she said finally, stepping into the kitchen. Mark smiled at her over his shoulder, and for a moment it felt normal, familiar. They ate together at the small dining table, their conversation light and easy. He asked about her day, and she asked about his. They talked about work, hobbies, anything that didn't touch the growing tension between them. But as the evening wore on, the air between them grew heavier. After dinner, Rachel offered to do the dishes, but Mark waved her off. "I'll take care of it," he said. "You've been working all day. Go relax." She hesitated, then nodded, retreating to the living room. She curled up on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through her phone as the faint sound of running water came from the kitchen. A few minutes later, Mark joined her, sitting on the other end of the couch with a glass of wine in hand. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, though he was already sitting. "Of course not," Rachel said, her voice quieter than she intended. They sat in silence for a while, the soft hum of the TV filling the space between them. Rachel tried to focus on the show playing on the screen, but her attention kept drifting to Mark, the way he sat so casually, his arm resting on the back of the couch, his eyes glancing at her every so often. "You seemed distant today," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Rachel blinked, startled by the comment. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, shrugging, "like you were avoiding me." His words made her heart race. "I wasn't avoiding you," she said quickly, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Mark's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, setting his wine glass on the coffee table. "If I ever make you uncomfortable, you tell me, right?" Rachel's breath hitched. She didn't know how to respond, whether to reassure him or to admit the truth. "You don't make me uncomfortable," she said finally, though the words felt like a half-truth. Mark nodded, leaning back into the couch. His eyes stayed on her, dark and searching, as if he was trying to read her mind. "Good," he said softly. "I never want to do that." The tension in the room was palpable now, like a string pulled taut between them. Rachel felt her skin heat under his gaze, her pulse quickening. She wanted to look away, to break the spell, but something kept her rooted in place. Mark shifted closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was light, almost innocent, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "You've got something," he said, his voice low, his fingers lingering near her cheek. Rachel swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The moment stretched on, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. And then, as if realizing the weight of what he was doing, Mark pulled back. He stood abruptly, clearing his throat. "I should head to bed," he said, his tone brisk, almost hurried. "Good night, Rachel." "Good night," she said, her voice shaking slightly as she watched him walk away. As the sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, Rachel sank back into the couch, her mind racing. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things, but the way her heart raced and her skin tingled told her otherwise. Oh, something had shifted between them tonight, and Rachel wasn't sure if she wanted to face what it meant. The days that followed were a delicate dance. Rachel kept herself busy, her routine carefully planned to avoid prolonged moments with Mark. Yet, no matter how much she tried, the tension refused to dissipate. It lingered in the air between them, heavy and undeniable, like a secret neither was brave enough to name. One evening, Rachel invited her best friend Jenna over for dinner. She needed a distraction, someone to ground her and pull her out of her swirling thoughts. Jenna was the perfect remedy. Bright, talkative, and always ready with a sharp joke or two. Rachel spent the afternoon cooking, hoping the familiar rhythm of chopping and stirring would soothe her nerves. When Jenna arrived, the house felt alive again. Laughter echoed through the kitchen as they shared stories and sipped wine. For a while, Rachel almost forgot about Mark. Almost. Halfway through their conversation, he appeared in the doorway. His presence filled the room instantly, his tall frame leaning casually against the doorframe. "Smells good in here," he said, his deep voice cutting through the chatter. Rachel's pulse quickened. She hadn't told him Jenna was coming over, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to hide it. "Hey, Mark," she said, forcing a smile. "Jenna, this is my stepfather." Jenna turned, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Ah, the infamous Mark," she teased, extending a hand. "I've heard so much about you." Mark shook her hand, his grip firm but polite. "All good things, I hope," he said, flashing a smile that made Rachel's stomach flip. "Mostly," Jenna quipped, shooting Rachel a playful glance. "She didn't mention you were so charming." Rachel's cheeks burned and she quickly busied herself with the dishes. She felt Mark's eyes on her as Jenna continued to chat with him, her voice light and easy. Rachel knew Jenna was just being friendly, but something about the way Mark responded, his low laugh, the way he leaned slightly toward her, set her teeth on edge. After dinner, the three of them moved to the living room. Mark sat in his usual spot on the couch. and Jenna sprawled out in the armchair, leaving Rachel to perch awkwardly on the edge of the ottoman. The conversation turned to light topics: movies, books, old stories from Rachel and Jenna's college days. But Rachel couldn't relax. She felt hyper-aware of every movement, every glance Mark sent her way. At one point, Jenna excused herself to use the restroom, leaving Rachel and Mark alone. The silence between them was deafening. "She's nice," Mark said finally, his voice low. Rachel nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, she is." There was a pause, and then Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You seem tense tonight," he said softly. "Is everything okay?" Rachel's heart raced. She wanted to brush him off, to tell him she was fine and change the subject. But the concern in his voice, the way his eyes searched hers, made her falter. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't look convinced. He reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly. "You know you can talk to me, right?" he said, his tone so gentle it made her chest ache. Rachel pulled her hand away, the movement quick and jerky. "I know," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Mark's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't push. He leaned back, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, before he turned his attention back to the TV. When Jenna returned, the atmosphere was lighter, but Rachel couldn't shake the weight of what had just passed between them. After Jenna left, Rachel busied herself with cleaning up, hoping the clatter of dishes and running water would drown out her thoughts. She was scrubbing a stubborn stain on a plate when Mark entered the kitchen. "You didn't have to do all this tonight," he said, leaning against the counter. His tone was casual, but his eyes were anything but. "It's fine," Rachel said, her back to him. "I needed to keep busy." Mark was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was closer. "You've been avoiding me." Rachel froze, her hand stilling in the soapy water. "I haven't," she said, though the words felt hollow. "You have," Mark said, his voice firm but not unkind. He stepped closer, and Rachel could feel the heat of his presence behind her. "Did I do something to upset you?" Rachel turned, slowly, her heart pounding. "No," she said, meeting his gaze. "You didn't." Mark studied her, his eyes searching hers. "Then what is it?" he asked softly. "Because I can feel it, Rachel. Something's changed between us." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Rachel didn't know how to respond. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off and pretend nothing was wrong. But the intensity in Mark's eyes made her chest tighten. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally, her voice trembling. Mark stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Don't lie to me," he said softly. "I know you feel it too." Rachel's breath hitched, her pulse roaring in her ears. She wanted to pull away, to break the tension and put an end to whatever this was, but she couldn't move. She was rooted in place, caught in the gravity of his presence. Before either of them could speak again, the sound of a phone ringing shattered the moment. Rachel jumped, stepping back quickly as Mark pulled his phone from his pocket. "I should get this," he said, his voice low. His eyes lingered on hers for a moment before he turned and walked out of the kitchen. Rachel sagged against the counter, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her hands trembled as she turned back to the sink, the soapy water now cold. She told herself it was over, that whatever had just happened wouldn't happen again. But deep down, she knew better. This was only the beginning. The days dragged by, filled with a tension Rachel couldn't escape. No matter how much she tried to maintain her distance, Mark's presence loomed large, filling every room he entered with an energy that pulled her in, whether she wanted it to or not. It was a quiet evening when the tension finally broke. Rachel had been working late, her laptop perched on the kitchen table as she sifted through a pile of invoices. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Mark had gone to bed hours ago, or so she thought. The faint sound of footsteps made her freeze. She looked up to see Mark standing in the doorway, his silhouette illuminated by the dim kitchen light. He was dressed in sweatpants and a plain t-shirt, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked as if he'd been lying awake, unable to sleep. "Still working?" he asked, his voice soft but carrying a weight that made Rachel's pulse quicken. "Yeah," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. She turned her attention back to her laptop, hoping he would leave. But he didn't. Mark stepped into the kitchen, his bare feet padding softly against the floor. He moved to the counter and poured himself a glass of water, his movements slow and deliberate. Rachel tried to focus on her work, but her hands trembled as she typed. "You should call it a night," he said, leaning against the counter. "You've been working too hard." "I'm fine," Rachel said quickly, though the exhaustion in her voice betrayed her. Mark didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a sip of water, his eyes fixed on her. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he set the glass down and walked over to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. Rachel's breath hitched. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but steady. Rachel's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "About what?" "You know what?" he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I can't keep pretending nothing's happening between us." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. "Mark, I don't—" "Don't lie to me," he interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. "I see the way you look at me, Rachel, the way you avoid me, the way your voice changes when you're around me. You feel it too, don't you?" Rachel's throat went dry. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. The truth hung in the air between them, undeniable and dangerous. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't." Mark's gaze softened and he reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "I know," he said quietly, "but I can't stop thinking about you. I've tried, Rachel. I really have." Rachel's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. She pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. "I can't do this," she said, her voice shaky. "I need to go to bed." Mark stood as well, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't block her path, but he didn't move away either. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice laced with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "If you walk away now, I won't stop you. But don't pretend this isn't real. Don't lie to yourself." Rachel stared at him, her mind racing. The room felt too small, the air too thick. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. But as she reached her bedroom door, she froze. She could feel Mark's presence behind her, the weight of his gaze on her back. "Rachel," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. The look in his eyes made her chest ache. Desire, guilt, longing, all tangled together in a way that mirrored her own conflicted feelings. Without thinking, she stepped closer. The air between them crackled with tension, the space shrinking until there was barely anything left. Mark reached out, his hand brushing her cheek, and Rachel closed her eyes, her breath hitching. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Rachel stepped back quickly, her heart racing. She glanced toward the window, recognizing the familiar headlights of her friend Jenna's car. Mark stepped back as well, his expression unreadable. "You should see who it is," he said quietly, his voice steady but strained. Rachel nodded, her mind spinning. She walked to the door, opening it just as Jenna was stepping onto the porch. "Ooh, surprise," Jenna said cheerfully, holding up a bottle of wine. "I thought we could have a girls' night." Rachel forced a smile, her heart still pounding. "Yeah, of course," she said, stepping aside to let Jenna in. As Jenna chattered excitedly about her day, Rachel couldn't stop glancing toward the hallway where Mark had disappeared moments before. Her chest felt tight, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she didn't know how to handle. That night, as she lay in bed, Rachel stared at the ceiling, the weight of what had almost happened pressing down on her. She told herself it was over, that the interruption had saved them from crossing a line they couldn't uncross. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, the house felt unnaturally quiet. Rachel avoided Mark entirely, retreating to her room with a mug of coffee and burying herself in work she wasn't actually completing. Her mind replayed the events of the previous night in a relentless loop. The words he'd said, the way he'd looked at her, the heat in his touch. It was as if her body was betraying her, reacting to something she didn't want to admit. But the worst part was knowing the truth. She didn't just want to forget it had happened. A part of her wanted more. By mid-afternoon, Rachel couldn't take the silence any longer. She grabbed her jacket and decided to head out for a walk, anything to clear her head. As she passed the kitchen, she saw Mark standing by the window, his back to her. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his face unreadable. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was a tension in it that made Rachel's pulse quicken. "Just out for a bit," she said, her tone clipped. She didn't stop to elaborate, but Mark stepped into her path before she could leave. "We need to talk," he said, his voice soft but firm. "There's nothing to talk about," Rachel replied, brushing past him. She reached for the door, but Mark's hand closed gently around her wrist. "Rachel," he said, his voice low, almost pleading, "you can't keep pretending this isn't happening." She froze, the warmth of his hand on her skin sending a shiver through her. Slowly, she turned to face him. "It's not happening," she said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded weak. Mark stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I see you, it's like I can't breathe." Rachel's heart raced. She should pull away, push him back, yell at him to stop, but instead she stood there, frozen in place, her breath catching in her throat. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. We can't do this." "I know," Mark said, his tone heavy with guilt, "but that doesn't change how I feel." For a long moment they stood there, the air between them crackling with tension. Rachel's mind screamed at her to move, to leave, but her body refused to listen. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly closer, drawn in by the intensity of his gaze. Mark's hand moved to her face, his thumb brushing her cheek lightly. "If you want me to stop, I will," he said, his voice steady. "But if you don't—" The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Rachel's chest heaved as she tried to find her voice, but before she could speak, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. They broke apart instantly, Rachel stepping back as Jenna walked in, holding a bag of groceries. "Surprise!" Jenna said brightly, completely unaware of the charged atmosphere she had just walked into. "Thought I'd stop by and make us some lunch." Rachel forced a smile, her heart still pounding. "That's great," she said, her voice shaky. Mark cleared his throat, stepping back toward the kitchen. I'll let you two catch up," he said, his tone brisk. Without another word, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Rachel standing there with Jenna, her thoughts a whirlwind. That evening, Rachel tried to keep busy, but her mind was a storm. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mark's face, heard his voice, felt the heat of his touch. She wanted to hate him for what he'd said, for making her feel this way, but she couldn't, because the truth was, she wanted him just as much. As the house settled into its usual nighttime quiet, Rachel found herself pacing in her room, her thoughts racing. She told herself to stay put, to lock her door and ignore the pull she felt, but her feet carried her down the hall, almost against her will, stopping in front of Mark's closed door. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Before she could decide what to do, the door opened, and there he stood, his expression a mix of surprise and something darker. "Rachel," he said, his voice low, "what are you doing here?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. I can't stop thinking about it." Mark stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said softly. Rachel hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp on the bedside table. Mark closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing in the quiet. For a moment they just stood there, neither of them speaking. Then Mark took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with emotion. Rachel nodded, her breath hitching. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said honestly, "but I can't ignore this anymore." Mark reached out, his hand brushing her cheek. "Neither can I," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As his hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, Rachel felt a surge of emotions, fear, guilt, desire, all crashing over her at once. And then their lips met, and everything else faded away. For the first time in weeks, the tension between them broke, replaced by something raw and undeniable. Rachel didn't know what would happen next, or how they would face the consequences of what they'd done, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was him. The morning light filtered through the blinds, soft and golden, illuminating the room in a gentle glow. Rachel woke slowly, her senses coming alive, one by one. The warmth of the blanket against her skin, the faint scent of Mark's cologne lingering in the air, and then the overwhelming realization of where she was, Mark's room. Her breath caught as the memories of the night before rushed back, his touch, his voice, the way he'd made her feel like she was the only person in the world. For a fleeting moment, She allowed herself to bask in the afterglow, but the weight of reality soon settled over her, heavy and suffocating. She sat up carefully, trying not to disturb him. Mark lay beside her, his features soft and unguarded in sleep. He looked peaceful, but Rachel's mind was anything but. What had they done? How could they come back from this? Quietly, she slipped out of the bed and gathered her clothes, the sound of her heart pounding in her ears. She needed space, time to think. As she opened the door and stepped into the hallway, she felt the air shift, heavy with the weight of what had changed between them. In the kitchen, she brewed a pot of coffee, her hands trembling as she poured herself a cup. She stared out the window, watching the world outside come to life. The normalcy of it all, a stark contrast to the chaos inside her. She barely registered the sound of footsteps behind her, until Mark's voice broke the silence. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and groggy. Rachel turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his t-shirt rumpled. He looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and concern, and it made her chest tighten. "I needed some air," she said softly, clutching her mug like a lifeline. Mark walked over to her, his presence filling the room. "About last night," he began, his voice trailing off. Rachel shook her head, her words tumbling out before she could stop them. "It was a mistake, Mark. We shouldn't have—" "Don't say that," he interrupted, his tone firm but not harsh. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "You can't tell me you didn't feel it, that it didn't mean anything." Rachel looked away, her heart aching. "It doesn't matter how I feel," she said, her voice trembling. "It was wrong. We crossed the line we can't uncross." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, it's complicated," he admitted. "But I can't pretend it didn't happen. And I don't want to pretend I don't care about you." Rachel's breath hitched, her emotions warring inside her. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let herself fall into whatever this was between them, but the weight of guilt, of what this would mean for their lives, was too much to ignore. "We have to stop," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. "We can't let this go any further." Mark nodded slowly, his expression pained. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, his tone heavy with resignation. "But you need to know, I don't regret it." Rachel's chest tightened, tears threatening to spill. She turned away, unable to face the raw honesty in his eyes. "I need some time," she said softly, "to figure out what to do next." Mark didn't argue. He simply stepped back, giving her the space she so desperately needed. "Take all the time you need," he said, his voice gentle. Over the next few days, Rachel threw herself into her work, avoiding Mark as much as possible. The tension between them was palpable, but neither of them addressed it. They moved through the house like strangers, their interactions polite but distant. Jenna stopped by one afternoon, her cheerful presence a welcome distraction. "You've been so quiet lately," she remarked, sipping her coffee. "Everything okay?" Rachel forced a smile, brushing off the question. "Just busy," she said, though the lie felt heavy on her tongue. But Jenna wasn't fooled. "You know you can talk to me, right?" she said, her tone softening. "Whatever it is, I'm here." Rachel hesitated, the urge to confide in her friend warring with the fear of what Jenna would think. "Thanks," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll keep that in mind." That night, Rachel lay awake in bed, her mind racing. She couldn't keep living like this. caught between what she felt for Mark and the guilt that threatened to consume her. Something had to give. The next morning, she found Mark in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and staring out the window. He turned when he heard her, his expression cautious but hopeful. "We need to talk," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Mark nodded, setting his mug down. "I'm listening." Rachel took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "What happened between us? It can't happen again," she said, her words firm but laced with emotion. "But I don't want to lose you. I don't want us to fall apart because of this." Mark's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. "I don't want to lose you either," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes, Rachel, I'll do it." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them heavy but not unbearable. For the first time in weeks, Rachel felt a glimmer of hope.